Mommy, that's Captain. 3 words. The first 3 words her daughter had spoken in 3 years. Vivian Cross froze on the park bench, her coffee cup slipping from her fingers and hitting the pavement. She didn't move to pick it up. She couldn't move at all. Her daughter, Emma, was standing at the edge of the playground, pointing at a man crouched by the swings, tying a little boy's shoelace. He looked up at the sound of the small voice, and his whole body went still too. Vivian's mind raced backward. 3 years, to a night she'd spent every day since trying to forget. A call at 2 a.m. Men in dark suits standing in her doorway. Words like hostage rescue and complications, and we did everything we could. Her husband, Daniel Cross, had been in that compound. He hadn't come out. For 3 years, Emma hadn't said a single word. Doctors called it selective mutism, trauma-induced. Therapists had tried everything. Vivian had spent more money than most. People saw in a lifetime trying to get her daughter's voice back, and none of it worked. And now a stranger in a faded gray t-shirt, sitting in a public park with his own son, had done what a decade of specialists couldn't. The man rose slowly, brushing off his knees. He had the build of someone who used to carry more than his own weight for a living, and the eyes of someone who hadn't slept well in years. He looked at Emma the way a person looks at a ghost they weren't ready to see. "You remember me," he said quietly. Not question. Emma nodded and walked toward him, small steps, deliberate, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head 1,000 times without ever letting the words out. Vivian finally found her legs. She crossed the grass fast, pulling her daughter gently back by the shoulder, though her eyes never left the man's face. "Who are you?" she said. It came out sharper than she meant it to. "Ethan Hale," he said. "I go by Ethan now." The name meant nothing to her, but something in the way he said it, careful like it cost him, something made her chest tighten. "She called you Captain," Vivian said. He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked. His son tugged at his sleeve, confused by the sudden silence between the adults, and Ethan put a hand on the boy's head without looking away from Vivian. "I was there," he said finally. "The night your husband died. I was the one who went in after him." The world tilted under Vivian's feet. For 3 years, she had pictured the man who failed to save Daniel as a name on a report, a stranger in a debrief room somewhere. She had never once imagined he might be real, might be standing in front of her holding his own child's hand, might be the reason her daughter had just spoken for the first time since the funeral. "You're the SEAL," she said. "You led that mission." Ethan's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. 3 years of a weight he'd never put down. "I let it," he said, "and I didn't bring him home." Emma reached out and took his hand. Vivian hadn't always been the woman people whispered about at galas, the widow who ran a shipping empire with a jaw set like iron and a daughter who never spoke. 6 years ago, she'd just been Vivian, a logistics analyst who'd married a man everyone told her was too intense to love easily. Daniel had been intense. He'd also been the only person who ever looked at her like she was. More than her last name, back before it was her name at all, back when she was still climbing out from under her father's company and trying to prove she could build something of her own. Daniel worked in intelligence, the kind of job he could never fully explain over dinner. She learned not to ask which countries he'd been in. She learned to recognize the particular quiet he carried home after certain trips. Emma had been born into that quiet. A father who came and went, who missed birthdays, and made up for it with an intensity of love that filled a room when he was present. Vivian used to tell herself that was enough, that the time he gave was worth more than the time he took. 3 years ago, Daniel had gone on what he called a routine assignment. He hadn't come back. What Vivian didn't know, what she was only now beginning to learn, was the shape of the night that took him. Ethan Hale had led a team into a compound to extract 3 hostages, one of them an intelligence officer named Daniel Cross. The operation had gone sideways in the last 90 seconds, the way operations sometimes did, no matter how many times you'd run the plan in your head. Ethan had gotten 2 of the 3 hostages out. He'd gone back in for the 3rd. He found Daniel already down, already gone by the time Ethan reached him. He'd carried him out anyway. Because you didn't leave a man behind, dead or alive, and because some part of Ethan needed to bring him home, even if home was a body bag and a folded flag. He'd left the military 18 months later, told himself it was time, told his team it was for his son, who was 2 years old and growing up without a mother of his own. She'd died in childbirth, a separate grief Ethan carried quietly beside the one that wasn't his to carry but did. Anyway, the truth was simpler and harder. He couldn't do the job anymore, not with Daniel. Cross his face in his head every time he closed his eyes. He'd moved 3 states away, changed the name he went by, not legally, just enough to put distance between himself and the reports with his name in them. Took a job doing security, consulting that paid less than a third of what the military had, and spent his afternoons in parks like this one, raising his son the way he used to imagine other men raise theirs. Present, unremarkable, ordinary. He never expected to see Daniel Cross's family again. He definitely never expected Daniel Cross's daughter to walk up to him in a park and call him by the name only his old team used. "How does she know you?" Vivian asked, still holding Emma close, though Emma had gone. Quiet again, watching the 2 adults with the careful stillness of a child who understood more than she could say. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "I was in the compound for maybe 4 minutes before extraction. I didn't think anyone saw me who could remember it." "She wasn't there," Vivian said. "She was 7,000 miles away, asleep in her bed." "Then I don't have an answer for you," Ethan said, and for the first time his voice cracked, slightly, just enough to show her the man underneath the careful composure. "I've asked myself every question about that night for 3 years. I don't have this one." Vivian studied him. Up close she could see what the composure was covering, the same look she saw in her own mirror some mornings. Someone who'd built a life around a wound and called it healing. "I want to know everything," she said. "Everything that happened that night. Everyone's. Spare me the details for 3 years." "I'm done being spared." Ethan's son tugged his sleeve again, asking if they could go back to the swings. Ethan, crouched down to his level, told him 2 more minutes, buddy, and when he stood back up his eyes met Vivian's with something that looked almost like relief, the relief of a man who'd been carrying a locked box for years and had just been asked to finally open it. "Not here," he said, glancing at Emma. "Not in front of her." Vivian looked down at her daughter, who was still holding Ethan's hand like she wasn't ready to let go of the first person she'd spoken to in 3 years. "Coffee," Vivian said. "Tomorrow. Just us." Ethan hesitated only a moment before he nodded. Neither of them noticed the way Emma smiled, small and quiet, the first smile Vivian had seen on her daughter's face in longer than she could remember. The coffee shop Ethan picked was 3 towns over from where he lived, out of habit more. The necessity, the old instinct of a man who'd spent a career making sure he wasn't followed. Vivian arrived first and sat facing the door. She'd left Emma with her assistant, Marisol, who had strict instructions to call if Emma spoke again, to write down every word. Ethan slid into the booth across from her 10 minutes later, out of uniform in every sense. Jeans and a jacket that had seen better years. Nothing about him suggesting the man who used to move through hostile compounds in the dark. Vivian found that harder to reconcile than she expected. She'd built an image of the man who failed her husband, and it didn't look like this. "Start from the beginning," she said. "I don't want a version they gave me in the debrief. I want what actually happened." Ethan turned his coffee cup slowly on the table, gathering himself the way she imagined he used to gather himself before a mission. "We had good intelligence going in," he said. 3 hostages, a compound with fewer guards than we expected, a clean extraction window. Daniel wasn't supposed to be in the building we breached first. Wrong information or information that changed after we launched. We didn't know until we were inside. You found him already hurt. I found him already gone," Ethan said, and the words landed heavier than she expected. Even after 3 years of imagining every version of that sentence, there was nothing anyone could have done by the time my team reached that room. Not me. Not a full trauma. Unit standing there. He was gone before we breached the door. Vivian's hands were flat on the table, and she watched them instead of his face, because looking at his face while he said this felt like more than she could hold. Then why, she said, quietly, have you spent 3 years blaming yourself for something you couldn't have? Stop. Because I was in command, Ethan said. Because the intelligence that got him moved to that room came through a channel I approved. Because somewhere in the 11 months of planning that operation, I made a decision that put him in a room I didn't clear first. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. I've run that scenario 1,000 times, and it never changes. But I was the one who signed off on the plan, and he was the one who didn't come home. And there isn't a version of that math that lets me walk away clean. Vivian felt something shift in her chest, an anger she'd been carrying for 3 years without a clear target, finally finding a shape it could press against. It would have been easier if he'd been careless. It would have been easier if he was the villain she'd built in her head on the worst nights, the incompetent stranger who'd let her husband die through negligence or arrogance. Instead, she was looking at a man who'd dismantled his entire life, trying to atone for a math problem that had no solution. I need to know one more thing, she said. Was he afraid? At the end, Ethan was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. He wasn't afraid. The last thing he said before we lost him, he asked if his family was safe. That's what he wanted to know. Not about himself. Vivian's composure, the composure she'd spent 3 years building in boardrooms and at her husband's funeral and at every single therapy appointment where Emma sat silent across from a specialist, finally cracked. She pressed a hand over her mouth and let herself cry in a coffee shop in front of a stranger for the first time since the funeral, and Ethan didn't reach for her, didn't offer the practiced comfort of someone used to managing grief. He just sat with her, in it, the way he probably should have been allowed to sit with his own 3 years ago if he'd let anyone close enough to offer it. I owe your daughter an apology I don't know how to give, he said finally. I owe you one too. You don't owe me anything, Vivian said, wiping her face. You brought him home. Do you understand what that meant? I had somewhere to bury him. I had somewhere to take Emma when she's old enough to ask to see where her father is. Some families don't get that. It doesn't feel like enough, Ethan admitted. It isn't, Vivian said. Nothing would be, but it's not nothing either. They sat in the silence of that for a while. Two people who'd been carrying pieces of the same loss in opposite directions for 3 years, only just realizing the weight might be easier held together. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Marisol. She's talking. She won't stop talking. You need to come home. Vivian's hand shook as she read it twice. She looked up at Ethan. It's Emma, she said. She's speaking. By the time Vivian reached the penthouse, Emma was sitting on the kitchen floor with Marisol, narrating a story to a row of stuffed animals like she'd never stopped talking a day in her life. 3 years of silence had broken open into something that sounded almost like a flood. Sentences tumbling over each other. Questions about her father, questions about the park, questions about the man named Captain. Vivian knelt down, and Emma threw her arms around her neck, and for a moment nothing else in the world existed except the sound of her daughter's voice. Can we see him again? Emma asked, pulling back. Captain, can we see him again? Vivian hesitated. Every instinct she'd built over 3 years of protecting her daughter told her to be careful, to slow down, to not let a 6-year-old's world get rearranged around a man they'd known for 2 days. But she also understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that whatever had broken Emma's silence had something to do with Ethan Hale, and undoing that connection now might undo the progress with it. We'll see, Vivian said, which was the closest thing to a promise she was willing to make. Word moved fast in Vivian's world. By the following week, her board had heard that the widow Cross had been photographed at a coffee shop with an unidentified man, and speculation moved faster than facts ever did in the circles she operated in. Her late husband's family, particularly his older brother Richard, who sat on the board of the family's charitable foundation and had never fully forgiven Vivian for how quickly she'd taken control of the Company after Daniel's death saw an opportunity. "You understand how this looks?" Richard said, cornering her after a foundation meeting. 3 years a widow, and suddenly you're meeting strange men. People will ask questions. Vivian, questions about the estate. Questions about whether you were properly grieving your husband, or whether there's something else going on. "He's the man who tried to save Daniel," Vivian said, keeping her voice level. "He carried my husband's body out of that compound, so I'd have somewhere to bury him. That's who you're calling a strange man." Richard's expression flickered, just slightly, and Vivian understood in that moment that he'd known. That the family had known who Ethan Hale was, had likely known his real name for 3 years, and had chosen never tell her. "You knew," she said slowly. "You knew who led the mission. You knew his name." "It wasn't relevant," Richard said. "The military handles these things. It's not our place to hunt down soldiers and relitigate operations. Daniel wouldn't have wanted that." "You don't get to tell me what Daniel would have wanted," Vivian said. "When you've spent 3 years making decisions about my life, you never bothered to include me in." She left the meeting shaking with an anger that had nowhere clean to land. It wasn't just Richard's silence. It was the slow realization that for 3 years, people around her, the foundation, the company's legal team, even some of Daniel's old colleagues who sent condolence cards every anniversary, had known more about the night her husband died than she had, and had decided, collectively, that she didn't need to know it. Ethan felt his own version of the pressure closing in. His old commanding officer, a man named Frank Castellano, who Ethan hadn't spoken to in over a year, called him 2 days after. The story of Vivian Cross's mystery companion started circulating in wealthier circles then. Ethan usually moved in. "You need to be careful," Castellano said. "That family has lawyers who eat men like you for breakfast. If this turns into something, if you start showing up at her life regularly, they're going to start asking questions about that operation again. Questions that could reopen things better. Left closed. Better left closed for who?" Ethan asked. "For everyone," Castellano said. "Including you. You walked away clean, Ethan. Don't walk back into the fire because a little girl called you captain in a park." But Ethan couldn't unhear his son's question that night. The simple, unburdened question of a 5-year-old who'd noticed his father hadn't smiled in longer than usual since the park. "Are we going to see Emma again?" Ethan didn't have an answer he trusted yet. But he knew, watching his son's hopeful face, that some part of him didn't want the answer to be no. 2 days later, Vivian called him. "Emma wants to see you," she said. "I want to know more about what happened that night. And I think whether either of us is ready for it or not, our kids have already decided something we haven't caught up to yet." Vivian hired a private investigator the same week, not out of distrust of Ethan, but out of a need she couldn't fully explain, a need to have every fact laid out in front of her instead of relying on secondhand grief passed through people who decided what she could handle. She told herself it was due diligence. Some part of her knew it was also fear, the quiet fear of a woman who'd been kept in the dark once already and refused to let it happen twice. What came back wasn't what she expected. The investigator, a retired detective named Priya Anand, who Vivian's legal team had used for corporate matters before, called her into the office a week later with a folder thicker than Vivian had anticipated. "The mission report you were given after your husband's death," Priya said, sliding a document across the table, "isn't complete. There's a section that was redacted in your copy. I got a version through a contact that wasn't." Vivian read it twice before she understood what she was looking at. The intelligence that placed Daniel in the wrong room, the wrong information Ethan had described at the coffee shop, hadn't been a simple error. It had come from a source inside Daniel's own agency, someone who deliberately altered the location data in the hours before the mission launched. The report suggested, carefully, in the bloodless language of internal investigations, that the breach may have been compromised from within, and that a full inquiry had been opened and quietly closed 18 months later without public findings. Ethan hadn't known. That was the part that broke something loose in Vivian's chest as she kept reading. He'd spent 3 years believing the failure was a math problem he could have solved with better planning, when the truth was that someone had moved the pieces before he ever had a chance to plan anything. Does he know? Vivian asked. I don't know what he knows, Prius said, but I know he was never given this report. It was sealed above his clearance level after he separated from service. Vivian felt her hands shaking as she gathered the pages. 3 years of watching a man dismantle his own life over a mistake that was never his. 3 years of her own quiet fury, aimed, without her fully realizing it, at a stranger who'd actually done everything right and paid for someone else's failure anyway. She drove to Ethan's house that evening without calling first, something she never did. Arriving control had always been part of how she managed her grief. She found him in his small backyard, watching his son ride a bike in unsteady circles around a plastic basketball. Hope, I need to show you something, she said, and I need you to sit down before you read it. Ethan read the report standing up anyway, and Vivian watched a man who'd spent 3 years methodically packing away his old life come apart in real time. Watch his hands tighten on the pages until his knuckles went white. This isn't possible, he said. I ran that operation. I would have known if the intel was compromised. You wouldn't have, Vivian said gently. That's the whole point. Someone made sure you wouldn't. Oh, Ethan said, and his voice had gone somewhere cold and flat, a register Vivian hadn't heard from him before, a glimpse of the soldier underneath the quiet father he'd built himself into. The report doesn't name anyone directly, Vivian said, but there's a name that comes up in the surrounding documents. Someone inside Daniel's own department. Someone who had access to the location data and a reason to want that mission to go differently. She hesitated before saying the last part, because she knew what it would mean once it was said aloud, knew there was no way to unsay it. The name is Richard Cross, she said. My husband's brother. Ethan went very still. Across the yard, his son called out, asking him to watch a trick on the bike, and Ethan lifted a hand, automatically, a reflex of fatherhood, surviving even through the moment his entire understanding of the worst night of his life came apart. Why would he? Ethan started, and then stopped because Vivian could already see him, arriving at the same place she had arrived at in the car on the way over. The foundation, the company, the swift and total control Richard had tried and failed to seize after Daniel's death. Control he might have secured cleanly if Daniel simply hadn't come home from an operation that was never supposed to touch him. I don't know yet, Vivian said, but I intend to find out. The days that followed unraveled faster than Vivian could control, and control was the one thing she'd built her entire adult life around. Richard found out about the investigation before she was ready for him to. A leak from inside her own legal team, she suspected, though she never confirmed who, and by the time she arrived at the Foundation's offices to confront him directly, he'd already had his own lawyers prepare a response. You're accusing me of treason, Richard said, standing behind his desk with a calm that unsettled her more than anger would have, based on a redacted document from a source you won't name. Do you understand what that accusation could do, Vivian? To the company, to Emma's inheritance, to Daniel's name. I'm not accusing you of anything yet, Vivian said. I'm asking questions. You're asking questions that could unravel a company thousands of people depend on for their livelihoods, Richard said. Is that really what Daniel would have wanted? For you to burn down everything he built chasing a ghost? It was the same argument he'd used before, wrapping his own self-interest in her husband's memory, and this time Vivian recognized it for exactly what it was. Don't tell me what Daniel would have wanted, she said again, quieter this time, more dangerous for it. You've used that sentence on me for 3 years. I'm done letting it work. Richard's lawyers moved quickly after that. A motion was filed questioning Vivian's fitness to continue managing the Foundation's board, citing her erratic behavior and unverified conspiracy allegations against a grieving family member. It was a bluff, mostly, but bluffs could still do damage, and within days, 2 major board members who owed Richard favors from decades back, began quietly distancing themselves from Vivian's leadership. At the same time, Ethan's world came apart from a different direction. Castellano called again, this time with less warning in his voice and more warning in what he actually said. People are asking about you, he told Ethan. People connected to Cross family money. Questions about your discharge, your finances, whether you've ever discussed classified mission details outside cleared channels. Someone is building a file on you, Ethan, and it isn't the government. 2 days later, Ethan's small security consulting contract, his only steady income since leaving the service, was terminated without explanation. The client cited budget restructuring. Ethan knew better. He sat in his kitchen that night, doing math he hadn't had to do in years. How many weeks of savings, how many weeks before he'd have to tell his son they might need to move again. Emma, meanwhile, had begun retreating. Not into silence, not fully, but into something smaller, watching the adults around her with the same careful stillness she'd carried for 3 mute years, sensing without being told that something was wrong, the way children always sense it. Is Captain going away? She asked Vivian one night, and Vivian didn't have an honest answer. That wouldn't frighten her. It was Marisol who finally said what Vivian had been avoiding admitting to herself. You're about to lose the company your husband spent his whole career building, Marisol said, protecting the memory of a man who may have gotten your husband killed. And the one person outside this family who's been honest with you through all of it is about to lose everything trying to help you find the truth. Vivian sat with that for a long time after Marisol left the room. She thought about the folder from Priya, still locked in her desk. She thought about Richard's calm, practiced denials. She thought about Ethan standing in his backyard, watching his son ride a bike in circles, carrying a guilt that had never belonged to him in the first place. And she thought about Emma's first words in 3 years, spoken not to her mother, not to a doctor, but to the one man who tried hardest to bring her father home. She picked up her phone and called Priya. I need everything, she said. Every document, every financial record, every phone log you can find connecting Richard to that mission. I don't care what it costs. I don't care who it exposes. I want the truth, all of it, and I want it before this family finishes destroying the one person who's actually earned Emma's trust. Priya called 4 days later with something Vivian had almost stopped hoping for. Financial records, Priya said, spreading printouts across Vivian's dining table. Richard made 3 transfers to an offshore account 11 days before the mission launched. The account traces back to a private intelligence broker who's been investigated twice for selling classified location data. It's not proof he altered the mission intel directly, but it's proof he paid someone who could have. Vivian stared at the numbers until they blurred. 11 days before her husband died, his own brother had paid someone with access to the exact information that got him killed. Why? She said, the question she'd been asking for weeks finally demanding an answer she couldn't avoid anymore. The Foundation's charter, Priya said. I pulled it this morning. If Daniel had lived another 18 months, control of the Foundation's board would have shifted permanently away from Richard's side of the family, per a restructuring Daniel had already filed paperwork for. Richard would have lost his seat, and with it, access to roughly $40 million in annual discretionary funding he's been quietly directing toward his own ventures for years. It wasn't a grand betrayal born of ideology or revenge. It was smaller and uglier than that, a man protecting his own money, willing to let his brother die on a mission across the world, rather than lose control of a budget line. Vivian sat with the papers for a long time before she called Ethan. I have it, she said. All of it. Enough to take to federal investigators. Enough to end him. She expected relief in his voice. Instead, there was a long silence. And then what? Ethan finally said. Then he faces what he did, Vivian said. I know what happens to the man who did this, Ethan said. I'm asking what happens to you. To Emma. This becomes public. It becomes a federal case. It becomes headlines for a year. Reporters outside your building. Reporters outside Emma's school. She just found her voice. Again, Vivian, are you ready for what happens to her the day this breaks? It was the question Vivian had been avoiding since the moment she'd read the first financial record, the quiet arithmetic of justice versus protection that she'd spent 3 years running from in different forms. If I do nothing, she said, he stays on that board. He keeps that money. And you keep believing a lie he built to cover his own crime. I know, Ethan said. I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm telling you I don't want you to do it alone, and I don't want Emma to do it unprotected. That was, Vivian realized, the first time in 3 years someone had offered to stand beside her in something instead of managing it for her, deciding for her, protecting her from information she had every right to hold. What are you suggesting? She asked. I still know people, Ethan said. People who left the service the way I did, quietly, who know how to build a case that can't be buried by expensive lawyers. People who'd want the truth about that mission out as much as I do, because it's not just Daniel's name on the line. It's Mine. It's my team's. Every one of us has spent 3 years believing we failed a mission that was sabotaged before we ever boarded a helicopter. Vivian felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in weeks. Not hope exactly. Something steadier than hope. A partnership she hadn't let herself imagine needing. Then let's do it right, she said. Together. 2 nights later, Emma crawled into Vivian's bed unprompted, something she hadn't done since before her father died, and asked a question that undid every careful calculation Vivian had made about protecting her from the truth. Is Captain in trouble because of us? No, baby, Vivian said, pulling her close. Captain is in trouble because he did something very brave a long time ago, and some people don't like brave people. We're going to help him. Okay. Emma nodded against her shoulder, quiet for a moment, then said the thing that made Vivian finally understand how much her daughter had been carrying in silence for 3 years. He didn't let go of Daddy's hand, Emma whispered. I saw it. In my dream. He didn't let go. Vivian held her daughter and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could match what a 6-year-old had just told her, that somewhere in whatever place dreams and memory and grief overlapped, Emma had seen the one true thing that mattered more than any report, or ledger, or family betrayal. A stranger who refused to leave her father behind. The Foundation's annual gala was, by design, the last place Richard expected a confrontation. 400 guests, donors, board members, a room built entirely around performance and polish, exactly the kind of setting where the Cross family had always done its business. Quietly, behind smiles that photographed well, Vivian chose it deliberately. She arrived with Priya's full file secured with the Foundation's outside legal counsel and copies, already delivered that afternoon to 2 federal investigators who'd spent the past week quietly verifying the financial trail. She arrived with Ethan beside her, in a suit that didn't fit him the way his old uniform once had, but that he wore with a steadiness she'd come to recognize as entirely his own. And she arrived with Emma, who had insisted, with a 6-year-old's unshakable logic, that she wanted to be there when the truth came out because Captain had been brave for her family and she wanted to be brave for him. Richard found them near the stage a half-hour into the evening, his smile faltering slightly at the sight of Ethan in a room he hadn't been invited into. This is a private event, Richard said quietly. It's a Foundation event, Vivian said. I'm still on the board. For now. Vivian, whatever you're planning, think about Emma, Richard said, dropping his voice. Further, glancing at the girl holding Ethan's hand. Think about what this does to her, to the company, to Daniel's name. I have thought about her, Vivian said. Every day for 3 years. I've thought about what it cost her to lose her father, and what it's cost this family to let his memory be used as a shield for the person who made sure he never came home. The color left Richard's face. Vivian didn't raise her voice. She decided days earlier that this moment didn't need theater. The truth was theater enough. She simply nodded to the Foundation's chief counsel, who stepped forward with a folder for the board chair, and within minutes, quietly, without a single dramatic gesture, the financial records began circulating among the small cluster aboard. Members near the stage, the same board members who'd been prepared days earlier to remove Vivian over erratic behavior. 11 days before the mission that killed my husband, Vivian said, her voice steady, enough to carry to the small circle that had gathered, though not so loud as to turn the whole room. Richard made 3 payments to a broker under federal investigation for selling classified location data. 18 months after Daniel's death, the internal inquiry into a compromise mission was quietly closed without public findings. 18 months after that, the board restructuring that would have cost Richard his seat and his $40 million in annual discretionary funding never happened, because Daniel never lived to file the final paperwork. "This is absurd," Richard said, too loudly now, drawing exactly the attention he'd spent the whole conversation trying to avoid. "You're going to destroy this family's name over some offshore transfers a forensic accountant can explain in 5 minutes. Then explain them," Vivian said, to the 2 federal investigators who already have copies. "They should be arriving any minute. I thought you'd want the chance to explain it to them before they explained it to the press." Richard's composure, decades in the making, cracked in front of a room that had spent years admiring it. Ethan stepped forward then, not for himself, though he'd earned every right to, but for the men who'd stood beside him in that compound 3 years ago, the ones who still woke up, believing they'd failed a mission that was never winnable to begin with. "My team has spent 3 years believing we made a mistake that cost a good man his life," Ethan said, his voice carrying the flat, controlled cadence of a man used to speaking in rooms where every word mattered. "We didn't make a mistake. Someone in this room made sure we never had a chance." Emma, still holding Ethan's hand, looked up at Richard with the plain, unfiltered clarity only a child could offer. "You hurt my daddy," she said, not loud, not angry, just certain, and something about hearing it from a 6-year-old who'd spent 3 years unable to say anything at all. Broke through the room's practice composure faster than any legal document could have. Security arrived 20 minutes later, not for Vivian, not for Ethan, but escorting Richard quietly toward a side exit as the first of the federal investigators arrived at the main doors, and the gala that Richard had built as a monument to the family's polish became, instead, the night everyone remembered as the end of his career. Vivian didn't watch him leave. She knelt down instead, in the middle of the ballroom floor, and hugged her daughter, who had just done something braver than anyone twice her age in that room. "You did so good," Vivian whispered. "Is it over?" Emma asked. Vivian looked up at Ethan, who was still standing beside them, steady in a way she suspected he hadn't felt in 3 years. "It's just starting," she said. Richard Cross was formally indicted 8 weeks later on charges related to unauthorized disclosure of classified information and financial fraud tied to the foundation's funds. He resigned from the board before the indictment became public, though it made little difference. The story broke anyway, and this time it broke around the truth instead of around Vivian's grief. The board restructuring Daniel had filed for 3 years earlier, delayed by his death, and buried by his brother's interference, was finally completed under Vivian's full control, with a new charter ensuring no single family member could ever again hold that much unchecked power over the foundation's funds. Ethan's old team reached out one by one over the following months, men who'd spent 3 years carrying a failure that had never belonged to them. Castellano called too, this time, without a warning in his voice, just an apology, quiet and overdue. The Navy conducted a new review of the mission, and while the findings remained largely sealed, Ethan received something he hadn't expected to need as badly as he did: a formal acknowledgement, delivered in person by a 2-star admiral, that the operation had been compromised by outside interference and that the team's conduct that night had been exemplary under conditions no one could have planned for. He didn't need the acknowledgement to know he'd done everything right, but some part of him, the part that had spent 3 years lying awake replaying a room he couldn't have saved, finally let go of a weight he'd been carrying long after it stopped being his to carry. He found steady work again within the month, this time consulting for a veteran support organization that helped former service members transition into civilian careers, work that felt less like punishment and more like purpose. His son started asking, with the particular bluntness of small children, when Emma was going to be his sister, a question that made Ethan choke on his coffee the first time he heard it and made Vivian laugh, really laugh, for the first time in longer than she could remember the second time she heard about it. Emma kept talking, not just to Ethan, though she still called him captain and probably always would, but to everyone, teachers, doctors, the mailman, a whole world she'd kept herself apart from for 3 years, rejoined all at once with the enthusiasm of someone who had a lot of catching up to do. Her therapist called it one of the fastest recoveries she'd ever documented, though she was careful to note it hadn't been fast at all. 3 years of quiet grief had simply finally found somewhere safe to land. On a Sunday 6 months after the gala, Vivian stood in the same park where it had all started, watching Ethan's son and her daughter race each other toward the swings, and Ethan came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Do you ever think about how strange it is," Vivian said, "that the worst night of my life and the worst night of yours turned out to be the same night?" "Every day," Ethan said. "And now look at us," she said. He didn't answer right away, watching their children instead, the easy, uncomplicated joy of kids who'd found their way to family through the wreckage the adults around them had survived. "I used to think surviving that night meant I owed your husband something I could never pay back," Ethan said finally. "I think I understand it differently now. I think he'd want to know his daughter found her voice again. I think he'd want to know she found it standing next to someone who never let go of his hand." Vivian reached over and took Ethan's hand instead, an answer neither of them needed to say out loud. "If you're still here, if you made it through this whole story with us, thank you for staying." Stories like this one remind us that the people who show up for us in our darkest moments rarely do it for recognition. They do it because it's who they are. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like Vivian and Ethan's waiting to be told, stories about the quiet heroes who carry other people's grief without ever asking for thanks. Let us know in the comments what part of their story stayed with you the longest. We'll see you in the next one.